Hello and welcome to this new situation report on the war in Ukraine. Russian offensives have increased across the entire front since April. The results of these offensives will be discussed. The Ukrainian offensive towards Kursk achieved several strategic objectives. We will also observe the impact of the increased long-distance bombings conducted by both sides. The F-16s boost Ukrainian morale but don't offset the hundreds of glide bombs Russia drops. We will also take stock of the material and human situation for both sides, and we will outline the prospects for the evolution of the situation in the short and long term. Before we continue, I remind you that this video is sponsored, and all of the sponsors' money is donated to charitable actions, which is marked by accelerating Russian advances. Since Russia is advancing by 63 km per month in 2023, and it's now 185 km each month, which is still 1,480 km since the beginning of the year 2024. In detail, of course, it's mainly the Donetsk Oblast where progress is strongest, with 1,053 km that have been conquered in the first 8 months of the year. But we must still put this volume into perspective, since in reality at this rate, it would take exactly 6 years and 4 months for Russia to conquer the 10,000 unoccupied kilometers of the Donetsk Oblast and thus invade the entirety of the Donbass. They are far from it, especially with large cities that could create bottlenecks and potentially serve as locks. The other area of progression for Russia is obviously in the Kharkiv Oblast, in which there were 283 kilometers that were invaded following the offensive that took place last May, and which collapsed as soon as the Ukrainians had the opportunity to bomb Russia and prevent the logistical influx that ensured this front. And so Russia has not achieved any of the objectives that were announced, and I refer you to the video in which we had precisely anticipated this unfavorable evolution for Russia on this front. Ukraine launched a major offensive in an unexpected area, conquering 970 km of Russian territory in the Kursk blast in early August. Additionally, 300 km are contested with ongoing battles. And if we take a step back, in less than a month that means that Ukraine has conquered as much territory in Russia as Russia has been able to take in Donbass since the beginning of the year, in 8 months. So we obviously see that when they launch an offensive in an undefended area, and Russia had not defended this area, of course it advances very, very quickly, and today they are struggling to retake it. As for material losses, we see a very clear increase in the number of losses for both sides since April, which is linked to the increase in Russian offensives during the period. And then we also see that on the Ukrainian side, there was the race offensive, which obviously, like all offensives, costs material and human lives. And that's why we have record material losses for Ukraine since the summer of 2023, but we still have a rate of material losses per square kilometer that are infinitely better on the Ukrainian side compared to what we can observe on the Russian side. According to the Oryx database, Russia has lost nearly 18,000 pieces of equipment since the war began, including about 5,000 armored fighting vehicles and 5,300 armored troop carriers based on visual evidence. Ukraine has lost 6,500 pieces of equipment, including 1,300 tanks and armored combat vehicles and over 2,000 infantry vehicles, which is 3 times less than their opponent. But the most interesting thing here are the trends that we can observe, and Russia is now losing between 1,800 and 2,000 pieces of equipment each month, but in detail we see a real shift. The number of tanks engaged is decreasing monthly, with 166 tanks lost in August, which is still massive. For comparison, the French army has a total of 200 tanks, although the quality differs between a minimally renovated Soviet tank and France's Leclerc tanks. But, incidentally, at the moment they have fewer and fewer, but in addition we can note that the proportion of tanks from the 60s already exceeds 20% of what is engaged by Russia. That is to say that we have both less and less heavy equipment capable of leading offensives, but in addition these are equipment that are less and less effective, less and less efficient, and this is also perhaps the first signs of a slowdown, and the fact that we are reaching the end of Soviet stocks and the Russian capacity to renew itself by taking vehicles out of this park. And this is also what we see for the BMPs, which are less and less present since the month of March. You see this curve in which there is a structural decline. As a result, to maintain the volume of equipment engaged, despite the decrease in available military equipment, Russia is increasingly engaging civilian vehicles, which already represent a third of the total Russian losses, to which must be added another 12% of losses, which are just trucks. So the presence of civilian vehicles, it's almost a habit on the Ukrainian side where there was a structural lack of military equipment. But now we see that Russia is even less well equipped than Ukraine, with now 45% of its losses being on vehicles that have absolutely no business being on the front line, with 4x4s, vans, trucks, and of course these eternal golf carts that have become a joke on the internet, but which are not normally meant to be on the front line. Since March, we also see the increase in Russian attacks that are carried out with simple scooters, motocross bikes, quads, which represent about 50 losses recorded each week. So it's really not about isolated cases. It's a method that we regularly see on the entire front, and which is also the consequence of the fact that this famous cannon fodder is coming back in mass. And that's why Russian human losses have never been as high as in this period, while finally the progress on the ground is not much more important than in the past. So if we go back to the equipment, well, Russia loses 150 to 200 artillery pieces monthly based on verifiable evidence. We also observe that the calibers are shrinking, with 4.72 inches and smaller pieces now accounting for 30% of monthly losses, whereas in the past it was predominantly larger calibers. When we look at the Ukrainian side now, we have an increase in the number of losses each month that actually follows the intensity of the assaults conducted by the Russians, with this peak in August, with 1,233 proven destroyed equipment, and this peak is obviously linked to the Kursk offensive, but overall we still remain on a ratio where Russia loses 2 to 3 times more equipment than the Ukrainians, and this ratio is still relatively stable. Since the beginning of the war, just in the month of August, we simply had 1.5 times more Russian vehicles lost than Ukrainians. But this is really exceptional in detail. Ukraine loses between 100 and 200 IFVs and tanks per month, as well as 50 to 100 pieces of artillery each month. And between 100 and 150 MRFs and APCs each month, obviously still to Ukraine's advantage. One area of concern, however, is the growth in the number of electronic warfare systems, and of Ukrainian radars that are proven destroyed, where the losses of both sides are now equal in volume, but Ukraine still relies on a production capacity that is much larger, since it has all the back in the day of all its allies who provide its equipment, while Russia has a lot of difficulties due to sanctions to be able to equip itself and to renew its stock. So in this area, yes, the Russians lose as much as the Ukrainians, but nevertheless, in the long term, it is structurally certainly better for the Ukrainians, who have a renewal. As for the human toll, it unfortunately continues to rise, since when we add up both sides, we reach 1 million human losses between the wounded and the dead. With a rate of losses, especially for Russia, which has never been as high as it is now, while we are rather on a structural decline on the Ukrainian side, from what we can observe, at least in open source, and according to the feedback we can get in different ways, and this is linked to the Russian offensives, which are relaunched with equipment of increasingly poor quality, to the relaunches of offensives in the style of tank and cannon, as in the time of Bakhmut, and for that we have a lot of images now that do not allow to doubt the reality of this situation on the ground. And at the end of July, the Russian human losses were already estimated at 135,000 dead, including 61,000 dead who are known by name with the OSIN research carried out by the BBC and Mediasona. That is to say that we really have the list of names of people who are really dead, and by checking in the cemeteries we realize that less than half of the dead only are known, which means that in total we have 110,000 dead simply in Russia at least, to which must be added another 23,000 dead from the DNR and the LNR, the former Ukrainian separatist zones in which men have really been engaged in very large numbers from the beginning of the war, with very, very important losses. But what is also interesting is to see the pace of new deaths, nominally proven, which varied between 100 and 240 new deaths per week since the beginning of the war. But the pace is still accelerating, since we have 7,000 new nominal deaths, which could be identified just in the month of August, which brings a toll of people whose name of the dead we know of 68,000. As well as 4,700 officers who are identified by ceremonies, posthumous award presentations, or condolence messages on social media. That is to say, in 1 month we have a 10% increase in the total number of deaths compared to what we knew since the beginning of the war in February 2022, and therefore the toll, once again, it is generally even worse if we include the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, and therefore we must certainly exceed 150,000 deaths for the Russian side since the beginning of the conflict. Examining the distribution of deaths on country maps reveals that minorities like the Buryats or Tatarstan inhabitants suffer the heaviest toll, adding at least 3 times more serious injuries to the 150,000 deaths totaling 450,000 people. Russia's total toll likely exceeds 600,000 losses. And once again, we are dealing with conservative figures, since I remind you that the Russian budget for the year 2023 had allocated a budget for 360,000 new disability pensions compared to the pre-war period, so a surge in the number of serious and irrecoverable injuries. And if we add to that the million men who fled the country to avoid the draft, in the winter of 2022 to 2023, Russia has lost 5% of its young male population of fighting and working age, obviously for reconstruction. It's going to be complicated. Moreover, Russia also classified in July the official figures that were until now public, such as inheritance claims or pension payments, which will make it even more difficult to confirm the figures we had in Oxine. But overall today, the Russian sources are still relatively close to what we could identify in open source, and so we will only have this information that is now exploitable, so we can still measure the number of recruits that is made from the expenses that are incurred by the regions which are the ones that pay recruitment bonuses. And so we estimate that there are 200,000 new recruits in the Russian army, which allowed to maintain this number of men available on the front. But nevertheless, this is not enough, since, as the offensive race has proven, in which we saw that there were only beginners in this area, and it forced Russia to strip the rest of the Ukrainian front. When I was there, they blessed this offensive race because, for them, in Zaporizhia, Luhansk and Kherson, the Russians stopped pushing. And we even also have the repatriation of militias like Birds, which were deployed in Burkina Faso, which were repatriated to be urgently engaged to try to stop the Ukrainians in the Kursk region. And it is estimated that the Ukrainian Kursk offensive required Russia to mobilize 55,000 men to launch a counter-offensive whose results are still to be awaited, since Putin had demanded that the area be totally liberated before October 1st. And this will obviously be a failure, since despite all the offensives they have launched, they have advanced by barely a few square kilometers. So overall, the Ukrainians are still in control in the Kursk region, since the Ukrainians even allowed themselves to launch a second offensive to certainly encircle the men who were west of the first pocket. As for the Ukrainian losses now, they are known with much more precision, since the comparison between what can be found in Ozint and the count of new coffins in the cemeteries is only an additional 30%, and so the UA Losses project has reached 53,000 recorded deaths since February 2022. That is to say that we probably have more than 80,000 deaths by adding the 30% who are identified, to which we can add up to 400,000 injured in the high estimates on the Ukrainian side, and this better proportion of survival on the Ukrainian side, it is mainly linked to the better survivability of the materials that are used by Ukraine, like the comparison of the Bradleys used by Ukraine against the BMPs used by Russia, and we see the proportion of each that is simply damaged and not destroyed. The number of survivors on board decreases as the destruction increases, which is very unfavorable for Russia, in which the majority of the equipment is destroyed and not simply damaged. On the other hand, unlike Russia, statistics show a decrease in Ukrainian deaths since February, when Ukraine has been on the defensive, although the losses from the August Kursk offensive likely do not yet appear in the data. And it must also be kept in mind that the Ukrainians have a human resources potential that is much lower than Russia, which explains why they are much more cautious with their men and why they do not engage them in the same way. However, the impact of the mobilizations from a few months ago is becoming evident on the Ukrainian side. While there, they told me that instead of 20 days in the trenches and 3 days of rest, they now had 20 days of mission and 10 days of rest, which greatly improved morale. And a second element is that the Ukrainians now have the right to retreat. Until then, they were asked to keep their trench, keep their tree line, almost to the death.
Now they have the right to retreat once they have made the Russians suffer enough.
And so these are two elements that explain the lower number of deaths that we have on the Ukrainian side now, even compared to last year. As for civilians, we no longer really have an evolution in the number of deaths. The UN records around 150 Ukrainian civilian deaths per month from Russian bombings, adding to the over 100,000 validated deaths since the war began, with more than 80,000 in Mariupol alone. But Russia even boasts through the voice of Maria Lvova of having moved more than 700,000 children from occupied Ukraine to Russia. Ukraine has provided a list of 19,000 children kidnapped by Russia from areas liberated in the 2022 major counteroffensives, and Russia refused to return them despite mediation attempts, including from several African states, and so Russia is very clearly mocking global efforts in the field. As for the fire report, the arrival of shells sourced by the Sheikh's Republic from May onwards had the expected effect, that is, a rebalancing of the artillery. Ukrainian authorities report firing 6,000 to 8,000 shells daily, which are both fired from the production increase that can be observed in the factories. Ukraine's supply has improved with the arrival of long-awaited stocks, as I was informed. When I was there, the 3rd Assault Brigade that I was able to visit in August, they really feel that when they are shot at, they can always respond, which was not at all the case in May. And even before, so the big advantage now for the Ukrainians on artillery, they can respond when they are shot at. As for the use of FPV drones, the famous kamikaze drones, Russia would have caught up, and it claims to produce 4,000 drones per day, that is to say 120,000 drones per month, while Ukraine on its side claims to consume 100,000 per month. And it wants to reach 150,000 drones per month by the end of the year. And when we look at the evidence of first-person view usage, however, here I'm not talking about the announcements of the two camps. We always see a very clear advantage for Ukraine, even if Russia is catching up. And this graph allows to see the proportion of equipment lost in each camp that are due to these drones. And you see that this now represents 3/4 of the material losses, knowing that for the price of an artillery shell, you can fire 10, 12 kamikaze first-person view drones with the results that we know. As for observation drones, the advantage remains on the Ukrainian side, which has resources that are provided by all its allies, as well as the heavy bomber drones that we call Baba Yaga. And this is really a Ukrainian specialty. There are almost none on the Russian side, and they are really used massively on the entire front.
We saw some small novelties on the Ukrainian side, especially with the termite launching drone, which allows to attack an entire Russian trench in a single pass. And on the Russian side, and the use of fiber optic drones, which was shown for the first time, while it was a technique that we knew among the Ukrainians, but it had not been much publicized. And I refer you to the article we had written in Air and Cosmos on the subject of fiber optic drones on the Ukrainian side.
As for aerial attacks, and a huge advantage on the side of, especially with the availability in very, very large numbers of these famous gliding bombs. They would fire almost 50 a day, with now also bombs that weigh several tons. So they are relatively inaccurate, but between the number they have and the massive explosives that are obviously available, it causes damage that is considerable. And these gliding bombs are really the only element that offers a competitive advantage to Russia and allows it to break through the locks of Ukrainian defense. And we obviously hope that the arrival of the F-16S will eventually make these planes fear every time they bomb ground targets, since the F-16S have anti-aircraft missiles that have a range greater than the gliding distance of these gliding bombs. And this will obviously make them flee, but we cannot expect it right away because there are not enough F-16S, and they are currently totally dedicated to the defense of the territory against cruise missiles fired by Russia. Ukraine also has gliding bombs, such as the French-supplied Atwasems, delivered at a monthly rate of around 50 bombs. They have an obviously very interesting effect. While joint direct attack munition bombs have been used on MiG-29s for nearly 2 years, and numerous videos showcase their impact, the overall effect is limited due to their lower mass compared to other munitions. As for the missiles, there are hundreds of missiles of different types being fired by both sides. Russia has Kh-101 missiles and Iranian kamikaze Shahed drones, which make up most of its fired weapons. On the Ukrainian side, attacks are also increasing, with successful strikes over 1,553 miles, as I mentioned when we met a few months ago. The founders were developing a drone and a missile, a cruise that carried a range of 1,864 miles. That's it. It proves that it is operational, and the real problem is the big gap that can be seen between the type of targets that are attacked by the two camps on the Russian side. We have a speech at the UN in which he explains that 97% of the targets hit by Russia are civilian infrastructures, and the World Health Organization, which therefore depends on the UN, has officially counted 1,940 attacks on the Ukrainian health system. I will put the link for you to go check these figures, like the bombing of the largest hospital. The event was held in Kyiv during July to support children with cancer in the country. You also have 3,000 schools that have been affected. Still, according to official UN figures, and the electrical network would have been damaged at least 80%, and you also have numerous infrastructures. For example, bridges that are targeted can be repaired relatively quickly overall, with diverted means that are quickly put in place, and for the 3% of Russian attacks against military targets, military sites that are currently legitimate. We can mention in particular the military school of Poltava, where there was a bombing at the time when the Ukrainians were organizing a ceremony, and they had the bad idea of announcing this ceremony on the internet. And there we count several dozen confirmed deaths. But overall, the Russians target these military infrastructures much less, like the country's airports, military airports that are still operational today, from which Ukrainian fighter planes take off and carry out dozens of missions each day, and which continue to be operational. While it's true that the Ukrainians have also adapted, they have more stocks of gigantic ammunition that has been scattered into hundreds of temporary small depots, which prevents Russia from achieving massive successes. So the proportion of missiles intercepted by Ukraine is relatively stable. On the other hand, we see a small increase in regards to kamikaze Shahid drones starting from the month of July, and this is perhaps precisely the first visible consequence of the arrival of the famous F-16s in the Ukrainian war army in July. And for example, during the attack of August 26th, Russia launched no less than 226 missiles and drones, with 35 that managed to pass the Ukrainian defense to reach their targets with the known damage. So on the contrary to the Russian method, we have every week Ukrainian feats that end up having a global strategic effect, for example, with the destruction of 3 large ammunition depots in 3 days in the last days of September, including the largest since the start of the war, which took place in Adfa on September 18th, and whose explosion caused an earthquake with a magnitude of 2.8 on the Richter scale.
A few days later, the same thing happened in Tikhoretsky on September 20th, but we also have weapons factories that are destroyed more than 1,553 miles from Ukraine, like this tank factory in Omsk, air bases with the proven destruction on the ground of Sukhoi 34 fighters in Morozovsk. There are also precious aeronautical maintenance facilities at Borisogledsk airport, or attacks on ships like the submarine Rostov, which is definitely sunk, or on the last ship capable of transporting fuel trains in the Sea of Azov, which forced Russia to restart fuel convoys on the Crimean Bridge, while its structure is normally too fragile for such heavy loads, since obviously the fire that took place at the end of 2022, so we'll see if it holds up.
In any case, the Russians have no choice, so the Ukrainians are also attacking Russia's potential for oil refining, and the country would have lost 34% of its pre-war refining capacity, including 14% just in the month of August, to such an extent that the Ukrainian strategy is now turning towards targeting fuel depots like the one in Proletask, where more than 30 tanks have been destroyed, or with successful shots up to Utra, which is 1,118 miles away from the Ukrainian border, as well as in the Leningrad region, supposedly ultra well defended. And so all this is still failures of the Russian air defense, which was supposed to be ultra dense and the best in the world. Obviously, the fact that Russian oil hubs are increasingly distant, increasingly attacked, makes Russian logistics increasingly difficult, with trucks having to cover distances that are always greater. But it is especially the financing capabilities of the war by Russia that are targeted here with these attacks. In any case, both countries will continue to increase their power in the field of long-distance bombing. For Russia, the goal will be to collapse the electrical production and survival means of the Ukrainians. And for Ukraine, the goal will be to reduce the Russian military potential and the ability to finance the war. The only notable new equipment in this area is the Ukrainian kamikaze jet drone Palanitsia, which flies at over 310.689 miles per hour over a distance of 435 miles, and which is apparently responsible for the attack on the Diva depot. As heard in this video, you can recognize the sound of a jet engine. And on the Russian side, it can't really be said to be a novelty, but they will be able to recover hundreds of Iranian ballistic missiles. And the big difficulty is that the Ukrainians don't have the necessary systems to intercept them. Unlike cruise missiles that are regularly fired and intercepted at over 90% ballistic missiles, there are only the Patriots and Mambasante systems provided by France and Italy that are capable of intercepting them. And there aren't even 5 available throughout the country, unfortunately. We move on to the point on material issues and the prospects of equipment for the two armies, with Russia now employing 3.5 million workers for weapons production, which represents 20% of the country's total manufacturing output, with a war effort that now represents a third of Russia's budget. As an example, Russia and its allies produce 3 million shells per year, while Ukraine only receives 1.3 million from its allies. But the situation could improve, especially with the rise of European power, which we are finally seeing the results of. The United States, on their part, must provide 1.2 million shells to Ukraine alone in 2025, and Europe must provide an additional 1 million, as well as other countries like Egypt, Azerbaijan, and Korea, who will continue to provide more and more. Russia, too, will rise in power. It aims for 5 million shells next year. But, as it needs to fire almost 3 times more shells to get the same results, well, its increase in power is not as fast as the increase on the Ukrainian side in the field of armored vehicles. Russia has also greatly increased its production, announcing plans to produce or release 100 to 120 tanks from depots per month, but even this official announcement from Russian propaganda, it is less than the proven losses that can be observed each month on the ground. So structurally, we know that the Russian army has fewer and fewer operational tanks in its army, and this is indeed this trend, which leads analysts to say that Ukraine would have surpassed Russia in the number of available tanks between the hundreds of copies it captured at the beginning of the war, or that they were supplied by its allies. There are also losses, which are weaker, especially because Ukraine is rather on the defense. However, satellite image analysis indicates that stocks of other armored vehicles will last at least until early to mid-2025. Even if their restoration seems increasingly difficult, which also explains the reduction in their number on the front. But so overall, what needs to be remembered is that the Ukrainians are indeed losing fewer armored vehicles. But they also originally had much fewer. Luckily for them, the deliveries are presumably higher than the proven losses, like the promised 300 tanks that are still to arrive, and which are still not delivered, also reflecting the new countries that are starting to support Ukraine, such as Qatar and Iraq, which are providing howitzers and artillery pieces, Argentine or Jordanian air defense that is now arriving in mass, armored vehicles coming from the United Arab Emirates, ammunition coming from Serbia, Kuwaiti tanks, which is obviously a gigantic diplomatic victory for Ukraine and a failure for Russia, especially seeing all the Arab countries that are gradually shifting in favor of Ukraine in this war. In the field of air means we have more and more reports coming from the Russians themselves, who are complaining about the decrease in the number of observation drones they have. And this is a development that is probably linked to the method developed by the Ukrainians, who shoot down Russian drones with their kamikaze FPV drones. And we have almost one proven case per day for several months now, thanks to this method. I refer you to the video in which we had analyzed this technique. The Ukrainian side has not seen an increase in drone numbers or capacity, despite increased production, as they are also experiencing losses. However, the weakening of Russian electronic warfare capabilities makes drones more effective, as they have better observation capabilities. So the constant volume allows for better efficiency than in the past. As for innovations in the Black Sea, we simply have this Ukrainian naval drone that has run aground. And on top we recognize an R-73 type anti-aircraft missile, which could explain some announcements of Russian helicopters shot down that were not counted, since there simply are no visual proofs in aviation. Nothing particular on the Russian side. Obviously it's the F-16S that have arrived on the field, and we should not expect strategic facts for these F-16S, at least before the end of the year, especially as they will be reinforced by the Mirage 2005, and this is really where there is a novelty. These Mirage 2005 already, there will be several dozen, but in addition they are being improved to be able to carry out bombing missions and not just air defense, as was the case when they were part of the French Air Force. And so we can also imagine other improvements. Why not a longer range radar and the integration of RR missiles that would also have a greater range? Overall, as you can see, we don't really have the effectiveness of any new equipment that will have arrived. The Russians, their big announcements have not yielded any results. The advanced equipment and innovations they announced haven't significantly improved progress on the ground. So in terms of communication, they are trying to publicize a lot of other major events that are not directly related to Ukraine. For example, they were supposed to organize Okan 24, which was the largest Russian naval exercise since the end of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, with 490 ships that had been announced. Except that by adding up all the images of all the parades that were carried out, the open source intelligence specialists were only able to count 74 engaged ships, which is barely 15% of the announcements. And it's the same thing in nuclear. There are a lot of gesticulations, there are a lot of demonstrations of the Russian nuclear potential that no one disputes anyway, but it has absolutely no interest on the front. And we will incidentally highlight the failure of the test of the future nuclear missile, the Sarmat, which took place on September 21st, which just created a crater 60 yards in diameter on the ground, because apparently the Sarmat exploded before taking off inside its silo. A little word on the help you have provided with armored evacuation vehicles, ambulances or industrial generators that could be offered to communities as well as to the Kharkiv hospital,
April, and that's 100% thanks to the civilian collections that you can make, and I congratulate you for your number and for the amounts that have been collected. As for the military aid, you have offered individual protection equipment, night vision binoculars, thermal drones that I was able to deliver in person. For example, here with Frank, there were vehicles like this one that was provided to the flash team, as well as electrical equipment that are essential to operate the equipment in the trenches, and portable jammers for teams like here with Kans in the backpack version, or here with Arsene the doctor from Lille, who was able to have protection on his military ambulance, which allows to jam kamikaze drones which arrive on them. And we also have a medicalized container called a stab net that was deployed very close to the front, and I offer you a dedicated video very soon, and that really saves lives. So I give you the links for the two collections, one for the military, one for civilians. The one that is for civilians, it's humanitarian. It is eligible for tax reductions. If you pay the other, it's not the case at present. We are going to make the observation to trace the perspectives on what can happen in the next months. First, we see that the front moves very, very little Russia. It progresses a little more than in the past, but it's still not enough to make the Ukrainian device collapse. And as long as Ukraine will be supported, obviously this front will not move. And so the question is the sustainability of the war for both camps.
The famous Russian advances on Pokrovsk or on Vuhledar, we must not neglect them. They are serious, they are difficult, but it is not that which will structurally make the whole of Ukraine collapse, and it is not that which will allow Russia to invade the Donbass this year, for example. Despite Russian propaganda, which I acknowledged to the trolls commenting to boost this video's visibility, the reality is different. So the question remains exactly the same. Is the balance between the two camps and the question of attrition. I told you a lot that the Russians are the ones who have the worst perspective, because yes, if the situation remains the same, it is indeed Russia who will have to give up its objectives first, since Ukraine replaces its losses, even sees a rise in power in many areas with the new aids that arrive and the arrival of fighter planes, which was not the case in the past, while Russia draws on reserves and increasingly old and less effective equipment, so its operational potential decreases over time, except that this balance and its prospects are only possible on condition of having stable and continuous support from Ukraine's allies. And that's a real question. Will Ukraine always be helped in the same way by its allies, who obviously have the means to do so today, but who do not necessarily decide to accelerate their support? It should also be noted that successes such as that of the offensive in the Kursk region is a tactical success. It is a strategic success, since Ukraine has removed a lot of pressure that was on the entire front, because Russia had to switch back some of its men. But on the political level, yes, it will put a sword above the Russians in the case of future negotiations, for example, the negotiations that are to take place in November. But overall, it can also give a false impression that Ukraine has an offensive capacity that would be correct, which is absolutely not the case, since Ukraine does not have the slightest chance of liberating its territory by arms with the material that is provided to it today. And all this is because of a support that is too weak, and the lack of political courage of the countries that support Ukraine and who would have the means to do much more. And that's exactly the difficulty. This impression that Ukraine is holding up, or even capable of launching effective offensives, well, it doesn't necessarily give the United States of America the impression that it needs to increase support for Ukraine, whereas it is absolutely essential, even if we want to reach the end of this conflict more quickly, to achieve peace, rather than seeing the two countries continue to exhaust themselves. And so there are two levers for this, to achieve this peace. The first is that the United States of America could tap into their huge reserves that they have used, for example, only 1% for tanks, or a few small percentages for other armored vehicles. And of course, we are talking about drawing only from the reserves and not from the equipment that is actually used by the American army. And the second lever, which also does not require any additional equipment, is simply to allow Ukraine to properly use the equipment that has been provided to them on Russian territory, where missiles are based to bomb their territory, where airports are based from which helicopters and fighter planes take off, with ammunition stocks, with a lot of things that could be hit up to a distance of 186 miles. While these small Ukrainian drones can travel further, they lack the penetration and explosive power needed to achieve the same results as larger drones. And so that's why a combination of missiles provided by its allies and drones that it is capable of using and producing itself is needed. And the most paradoxical thing is that this situation offers Russia total impunity in their attacks. So there are France and Great Britain who have, for example, said that Ukraine has the right to use their Scalp and Storm Shadow cruise missiles on Russian territories, except that there are American components, for example, some optics that are in the French Scalp missiles, which means that it is the Americans who can forbid the French from allowing the Ukrainians to use their weaponry. This demonstrates a dramatic lack of national sovereignty. These two small components allow the United States to block us in our strategic choices to defend Ukraine and to defend Europe and our continent. This is absolutely catastrophic for our sovereignty. We really need to evolve in this area to be totally what we call hit-hard-free and no longer rely on the Americans. So the Ukrainian proposal, it is very simple, it is very logical to me. That is, they simply want to restore parity. It's not an escalation, as it's merely matching the Russians' actions. If the Russians fire without missiles, they should expect the same treatment in return. If Russia allows itself to violate treaties by recovering long-range weapons of Iranian origin, as Lavrov directly boasts, then we must also provide them with missiles that are not bridled. And above all, we must offer prospects to Ukraine in which it will win. If we tell Ukraine, tomorrow, you will receive 1,000 tanks per year, hundreds of fighter planes per year, and it is only under this condition that Putin will give up when he is certain that he has no chance of being able to conquer even just the Donbass. I'm not saying that Ukraine will be completely liberated from its territories. I don't know if the Russians will voluntarily withdraw. I don't really believe it. But in any case, Russia needs to know that it cannot win. And this is how we will avoid having an extension of the conflict in neighboring countries, whether it's Georgia, whether it's the Baltic countries, whether it's Moldova, all these countries that simply want to be protected because they know that they are threatened if by misfortune Ukraine should not be able to resist Russia. For the production of this video, I obviously thank Kenza, who works with me, as well as Gaetan and Dorian, who write great articles in Air and Cosmos, and whom I also use for the production of these videos, but also my incredible community on my Discord, who work, who source, who take note of situations, who participate in the writing of these situation reports. Thank you to you. You are many. You are invisible, but without them, this would not be possible. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you very soon.